Hi, we are Team 7 and we are gonna present euthanasia should be approved. I'm Carla and my teammates are Herman and Jose Fabian. Okay, so what is euthanasia? What does it mean? For a little bit of context, is when a doctor is allowed by law to end a person's life by painless means, as long as the patient and their family agree. For example, if a patient is in a really critical state and in constant suffering or pain, and its condition can be improved by any treatments or medications because of the disease, or there are not enough studies or technology to help the patient's health condition. In this circumstance or situation, the patient can give his consent to leave this world without any pain. Of course, the patient is already informed about his situation and as well as his family. And this decision can be is premeditated. Of course, it shouldn't be taken one day to another, and the doctor is have the obligation to give them enough resources or knowledge about the theme of euthanasia to the patient, of course, to make the right decision. And euthanasia shouldn't be confused with assisted suicide, mainly because in this situation a doctor assists a patient to commit suicide if they request it. The patient doesn't need a necessarily terminal condition. So in both in euthanasia and assisted suicide, the patient is who takes the decision, but the main difference is that euthanasia is linked to the patient's condition, while assisted suicide doesn't need exactly a terminal condition or a constant physical pain that could affect longevity of the patient's life. So the next is voluntary and involuntary euthanasia. Voluntary euthanasia is when it's conducted with consent and the patient is well informed about his situation and the consequences of it. So I already mentioned, the voluntary euthanasia is when the patient, of course, make his decision, give his own consent about it, and is really and well informed by the doctor, and his familiars are aware of the consequences, of course. Voluntary euthanasia is currently legal in the Netherlands and Washington, D.C. Voluntary euthanasia have a branch which is non-voluntary. Non-voluntary euthanasia is conducted by another person on behalf of the patient. This is when a person is unable to consent due to their current health condition. That's why the decision is made by another person who's appropriate, of course, and normally our familiars, really close familiars, and knows the patient consent or opinion about it. This is based on their quality of life and suffering of the patients, of course. In other words, another person take the decision because of the patient's condition, and of course should be someone that should be appropriate, not only the guy you just met, or even the doctor. It should be someone the patient trusts and really knows, or a person who really knows the patient. And of course there is involuntary. This is considered murder, and is when euthanasia is performed by another person and not the patient, either because the patient do not want to die or because they're not asked or well informed. This is normally out of patient's will. And this is why patients should be well informed about the situation, about maybe the patient really don't want it, but the doctor informed him really badly, and there are many reasons why a decision or isn't his will. This is why it is considered really murdered, because it's out of patient's will.
Is euthanasia legal in Mexico? This is what you need to know. In Mexico, euthanasia is prohibited in the Federal Penal Code. However, in several states of the country, there is an advanced direct law that allows the refusal of life-prolonging treatments. In 2007, a congressman spoke in favor of euthanasia in the capital of Mexico. And according to WHO, World Health Organization, the action of a physician who deliberately causes the death of a patient is not legal, but there is a law of anticipated will. And what does this mean? The practice of euthanasia and medically assisted suicide, according to Article 161 bis 21 of the General Health Law, is prohibited. It is prohibited the practice of euthanasia, understood as mercy killing, as well as assisted suicides, as stated in the Federal Penal Code under the protection of this law. Euthanasia is a part of the human right to have a dignified death, and there are different means to achieve it, without suffering, in accordance with the person's values. While only 7 countries in the world is legal right now, in Mexico the decision to suspend or refuse life-prolonging treatments and palliative care is allowed, said Asunción Álvarez del Río, professor of research and Department of Psychiatry and Mental Health of the School of Medicine. Euthanasia is legal only in 7 countries, as I said before: Belgium, Luxembourg, Colombia, Canada, New Zealand, Spain, and the Netherlands. The Advanced Directive Law allows patients to refuse treatments they no longer want, which only prolongates their life and causes them suffering. This can be done directly or by means of an Advanced Directives document when the patient is unable to say so directly. The person stops receiving treatment that has no longer helped him or her. In 2008, Mexico City was the first state to approve this law, and it was also approved later on Coahuila, Aguascalientes, San Luis Potosí, Michoacán, Hidalgo, Guanajuato, Guerrero, Nayarit, Estado de México, Colima, Oaxaca, Sonora, Yucatán, and Tlaxcala. According to the National Institute for Elderly, it is not necessary to be ill or suffer an accident to sign an advance directive. In order to exercise the advance directive, there are 2 modalities. You can ask for this paper either via a lawyer or in a medical institute. For example, an elderly house, a cancer state thing. And this is the only 2 ways that you can get this free will death. The legalization of euthanasia and its social acceptance is promoted with 5 types of arguments. The right to a dignified death, expressly desired by those who suffering atrocious suffering. The right of each person to dispose of his or her own life in use of his or her freedom and individual autonomy. The need to regulate in a situation that exists in fact in the face of the scandal of its persisting in hiding. The progress represented by surprising the life that profoundly mentally handicapped or terminally ill, since these are lives that cannot properly be called human. The manifestation of social solidarity represented by the elimination of meaningless lives, which constitute a heavy burden for the relatives and the society itself. What are the arguments against it? Well, the euthanasia debates reveals which are state or political duties, in which are personal duties. The protection of human life is a political duty that cannot be relegated to the particular or private morality of each individual. Physical life is a good, universal good that cannot be threatened by any circumstance. In this sense, there are 2 different levels: juridical, political, and morality. In either case, the right to the protection of the physical life of each person and under any circumstance of illness or old age is the foundation that protects us of the ethical criteria of others, about our own existence, from the way in which others, and even from the particular morality of the one who does not always discover the respect due to the other, such as the doctor who practices euthanasia. What guarantees should not an approval of euthanasia have? Within the legislation, the state must necessarily establish the limit of frameworks within which law will have its effects, and therefore how it will be applied. To this end, it must stipulate who is addressed, who are the persons, institutes obligated, and they have to specify and they have to be effective with it. who are protected subjects under obligations, and their temporal scope in which such obligations and rights are enforceable. The law should define the context of serious and intolerable suffering in which the request for an implementation of the aid in dying benefit can take place, as well as the external assessments of the person requesting it, and the professional team that must provide the necessary assistance to help the person who has been granted the benefit to die. What is the difference between suicide and euthanasia or assisted suicide in a terminal context? Well, human rights are not granted by the number of votes obtained, nor by society, nor by political parties, although they must always be recognized and defend them. Nor are they based on social conscience, since rights are possessed by each person, because he or she is a person. Voting does not change the reality of man, the dignity and value of life. The right to die is not constitutionally regulated. The availability of one's own life such as does not exist on the Constitution. If this is absolutely right to life existed, there would be other rights such as the possibility of selling one's own organs voluntarily, accepting slavery.
Okay, now I'm going to talk about facts about euthanasia and assisted suicide. Let's start knowing that 107 of the World Medical Association's 109 constituent national medical associations oppose euthanasia and assisted suicide. In the past 2 years in Belgium, 3 children, 77 people suffering from mental health issues, and 173 people with no physical suffering but afflicted by conditions such as addiction, loneliness, and despair were euthanized. Despite only being legal for 3 years in Canada, the practice of euthanasia is widespread. At least 2,614 people were euthanized in the 10 months between January 1st and October 31st, 2018, equating to about one person dying by a lethal injection every 3 hours. In the first 2 years of legalized euthanasia in Quebec, 62 deaths, the 5.6% of all euthanasia deaths, were deemed by the Commission on End-of-Life Care to have been of abuse by the doctor who prescribed and administered the lethal injection, but the Commission did not recommend any for prosecution. Now, a little bit about the main causes of assisted suicide, being this: losing autonomy, less ability to engage in activities making life enjoyable, loss of dignity, losing control of bodily functions, and burden on family, friends, and caregivers.